Hey guys, and welcome to episode 39 of Creators Campfire. If you're new here, my name is Barb, and tonight's guest is a fellow podcaster. His name is Clouse, and he has an amazing podcast called Creative Elements. It is one of my favourites, and the production quality is fantastic. Not only that, but he has some of the best guests, and I am incredibly jealous, but we'll get all into that as we go. Guys, please welcome Jay. Jay, hello.
Hello, Bob. So great for you to have me here. Grateful to be here on the Creators Campfire 30, you say episode 39?
39, yes.
Oh my goodness. I had no idea you'd been doing it so long already. Congrats.
I know, thank you. I think I must have started around the same time as yours, because if I'm not mistaken, you kicked off just over a year ago this week.
Yeah, the 24th of March 2020.
Amazing. And episode 1. Right, talk about great guests. You started with Seth Godin. What was that like?
It was great. He showed up in a sound booth with a cup of coffee or tea, and his audio was phenomenal. And he was just ready to go. You know, I'd been doing podcasting for a couple of years on a different show, but this is a guy I really, really look up to. He showed up in like the most professional sound setup possible. And I thought like, okay, I need to give him a big like prologue as to how this is going to go, because I give that to just about every guest, and he was very much just like, yep, I got it, cool, yep, 45 minutes would be great, I'm ready, let's do it. I was like, oh my god, okay. But was very gracious for his time. He was very very friendly, very personable. Seth has a very final way. He has like a lot of finality to his answers, so they don't necessarily invite follow-up questions, especially when you're not super experienced with interviewing, because everything he says like has just so much weight to it, and is said in such a way where he's confident that this is the way it is, that's how it is, there's no arguing. And it's just really kind of jarring, because he'll also end things kind of quickly too, and you have to really be on your toes to keep it feeling fluid and like a conversation. And it was a little bit of a challenge, but glad how the final episode came out, and that's what matters.
As someone, and clearly I am inexperienced, as someone who tends to see how the conversation flows and vibe off that, as I'm sure a lot of people do, that must have been really, really difficult. So how much prep did you do? And I guess with someone like Seth, does that make you even more nervous?
Not really. I actually prefer to talk to guys like Seth, who I've been following for a long time, because the prep has been done for years of following their work. I just know it really, really well. The harder prep comes from a guest that I don't know very well at all, because how do you very quickly immerse yourself in somebody's body of work who's been doing it for years and years and years, and not let that consume your entire week? So for Seth, it wasn't so bad, because I've been following it for so long, and I had a lot of my own questions already, because most of the time Seth talks about marketing, branding, education, and my show is all about, well, how did you get to actually build a full-time living from this? Like, talk to me about the business behind this, how that was built, what that looked like. That's where I like to focus my interviews, on creative elements, and Seth doesn't talk about that much. So, and most of the people I talk to don't talk about that much. So it's a lot easier for me to kind of dig into that direction, because also at a base level, the questions start to become fairly similar. It's like, tell me what you're doing before this. How did this start? How did that grow, and what were the memorable, inflection points along the way that stand out to you as pivotal and helping you to actually make a full-time living from this? And then you dig down into the bonus paths that kind of emerge from the interview. It's fairly simple to do in that way, but the more context you have about somebody's body of work, the easier it makes the interview generally.
Yeah, actually, you've touched on a really good point, and something I was going to ask you is, because you have such high-profile guests, they are obviously people who do podcasts or interviews quite regularly. So how do you go about making sure you offer something different and you don't just ask the same questions? Because I'm sure that's what most people are worried about. I don't want to be the other person that's asked this for like the 100th time. So how does that kind of look for you?
Like, there are a couple of very tactical things you could do, like actually listen to a bunch of interviews and hear what questions are coming up. This is how I typically prepare for interviews as it is I listen to other interviews. And the more recent they are, the better, because I know what's on their mind, and I also know what's been talked about most recently. Sometimes you hear stories that you only hear on one of these shows that are really interesting, and you realize, actually, I want to tell that story on my show too, so I'm going to lead us in that direction. But a lot of times you hear similar questions, and you think, I don't need to ask this, because when you ask a similar question, that guest has now rehearsed that story so many times that it takes them a little bit out of the moment. Now they're just sharing what they've already shared a bunch of times before. It's very prepared. So I do like to ask questions that are not frequently asked, and the nature of my show helps me do that, because James Clear was episode 2. Most people talk to James about forming habits. I didn't talk about habits at all in our interview, especially because I talked to him after he did kind of a circuit for the book, and everyone was talking about habits because that's what the book was about. I very much want to go counter to that and say, what was it like inside your head writing this book for a year, not getting, external feedback? And it creates a new dynamic, a new experience that's hopefully more memorable for the guests too, because it stands out as different. And then I try to close the loop on that by making an exceptional piece of audio that I put a lot of time into producing too. So it becomes something they really think stands out in their mind, and they're more likely to recommend that their successful friends come on my show. They're more likely to share it, which is still fairly unlikely, but I give myself at least a better chance.
And these are two things that stand out. One is your guests, and one is your quality, like I spoke to. And it's almost a chicken and egg thing, but not quite, because I think if you go back to the root of it, the quality stands out to then bring the guests. But it's kind of that back and forth, right? So you create this amazing quality. Well, you started with a great guest. You create something that's such amazing quality, and then you bring on another guest to say, hey, I've got this amazing podcast, and the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, and that kind of goes back and forth. How did you kind of approach, when you decided that you wanted to do a podcast, how did you approach that? And what was the thought process behind, making it what it is?
I wanted this show to be commercially viable. Like, I wanted it to actually generate a decent income that justified its existence. And that's hard in the podcasting world. It's hard in any creative medium, but I knew that it would come from a lot of listeners. Okay, how do I get a lot of listeners? I need a really good, remarkable show. And the style that I've taken, the emphasis I put on bigger names was more so a marketing tactic for listeners and also a heuristic for future guests than it was kind of the end-all, be-all. I'm actually trying to drive the show in a direction where more and more I'm talking to lesser known but still independent creatives who have made their mark in much nearer proximity as far as timeline goes to the listener today. Seth's a great example. Seth's been writing online for decades. The way that he's built his brand has been, in no small part, due to the longevity of that and doing it early in the internet's existence. That opportunity doesn't exist for people today the same way that it did before. So when I talk to an On Laura Lacan for David Perel, who have done this much more recently, their insight is different and potentially more applicable to people listening today. And as I go more and more in that direction, I'm bound to have lesser known names to the average listener. And I want the listeners to trust me that it's still going to be worth their time listening to. And that comes from producing a really good product, I think. But when I go out to big names, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to look at my previous guest list. They're going to look at my number of reviews on Apple Podcasts, and they're going to make a very quick judgment. Is this worth my time? And so I'm trying to stand out to them on one of those two fronts, if not both. And that was why I went with Seth and James from the beginning. And why in my pitch emails today to future guests, I still name them as guests that I've had on the show, along with Tim Urban and Vanessa Van Edwards and Ash Amberger. That type of heuristic helps me get those people on the show. Then they go on to say, I'm glad I did that because the product was good and because it actually has an audience. And hopefully, they see a little bit of a bump from it.
You've pitched it right from the beginning of where it is because you've known going in where you want it to be. Unlike somebody like me who is just like, oh, I think I'll do a podcast and we'll see where it goes. But doing it over, I would take a slightly different approach. But this wasn't your first podcast either, was it? So how much of your learnings from your previous podcast did you bring into this one?
So much. So much. but more so than learnings. Like, yeah, I learned the very logistical process of what it takes to produce a piece of audio and get it uploaded so that it can be heard by other people. But even more so than that, I think I learned how to interview and how to be comfortable on the mic. Like, that just comes from repetition. And we had probably published 150 or close to 150 episodes of Upside, my other podcast, before I launched Creative Elements. So I just had a lot of reps and felt very comfortable. So I could talk to Seth, and even though it was a little nerve-wracking and stressful, like, I think that interview is still a good interview, and I was calm and confident enough to talk with him. There are moments on the show where I fanboy a little bit, and I often remove that in the final piece and replace it with narration, because it's not something I like to do. It's an uncomfortable experience for the person on the other side of the thing. For any creator, you want to know your work is impacting people, but when you have the one-to-one discussion and you're not given like a very specific way their work impacted you, and they're just like, oh, I love your work, I've been following you for years, it feels a little weird, and you don't want to be that guy. And so I try not to be that guy in the interview, and if I was, I regret it and I take it out in the final product. But it's actually not that endearing, surprisingly. It's like uncomfortable in some ways sometimes, so I try just not to do that.
That is a really good tip, because I think I am definitely somebody who does that. And I guess that comes from inexperience. Like you said, it's clearly something you've learned along the way. And
well, I was just going to say, people in that position, they just want to be a person. And they want other people to talk to them like they're a person. When you fanboy over somebody or fangirl over somebody, you are implicitly othering them in a seemingly positive way. You're saying like, you're so great. I am down here. And this person just wants to be like, no. We are people. We are different people, but we are people. But now I feel uncomfortable because you're looking up at me and I'm saying, I don't want to be up here. Don't put me up here. You know?
I think that's actually incredibly good advice for anyone who is doing any of these interview type situations, or just in that situation in general, because I've never even thought about it like that. I've always gone, oh my God, like, not, hey, this is done, but this is acceptable because this is what you do. But I think that's actually a really, really good thing to point out, and good advice for anyone in that position. One of the things that stood out within like the first 30 seconds of me when I first listened to your podcast was, when I talk production quality, I'm not just talking, oh, there's clean audio. I'm talking, this is an experience, because you start listening to it and it's the way it's done. Okay, so if I take mine as an example, and from what I've heard what other people do, it's an intro and then it's almost kicking off into the conversation. But you have A, such a great intro, and B, this narration that you've talked about that flows through the conversation. What was the kind of inspiration behind that? I'm sure it wasn't just to take the fanboy moments out. And how did that come about?
Well, real quick point of clarification so I know what you're saying. When you say I have a great intro, are you talking about the intro music or the intro to the guest and the interview?
Yes, sorry. Well, the music is great, but yes, the intro to the guest and how you bring in snippets from it's kind of like a coming up, but it's done in such a great way that it's, I don't know how to describe it or compare it to something, but it's not just, hey, here's a quick spiel about the guest. It's, hey, this is going to make you really want to listen to this episode.
Yes. Okay, good. I was hoping that's what you're saying, because this is where I really do try to make the show stand out. And I think it's an opportunity for a lot of podcasters to make their show stand out, because the thing is, when I click play on an episode, I want to have certainty as quickly as possible and for as long as possible that this was a good decision. And if I click play and it's not clear what this episode is about or what I'm going to get out of it or why I should care, and it gets into an interview, now I'm waiting for a moment in that conversation to convince me that this was worthwhile. And what I try to do with Creative Elements is lay out the context for the listener, why this episode exists and why you should listen, why I'm excited to host this guest and why I was excited to create this episode, and why you should be excited to listen to it. So it's all about context, because the worst thing you can do as an interviewer is to ask the guest to introduce themselves. Oh my gosh, biggest pet peeve, because they're going to be humble. You had that guest on for a reason. Chances are they're a badass. if they're a badass, they're going to be humble and not say, well, let me start by saying I'm a badass, and here are some incredibly impressive things that I've done, some awards that I've won, some distinctions that I hold. They're not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that. But the listener needs to know that distinction is important, because if you are interviewing somebody who is a badass, let's say that they are a Nobel Prize winner, and you get into the interview and it feels incredibly mundane, like this is just a regular person, that can be really interesting, colored by the context that this person won a Nobel Prize. It really humanizes them and makes you feel like you can do this. Absent of that knowledge of they won a Nobel Prize, you may think this interview is incredibly boring and not teaching you anything. So the context is really important. And if you're going to go through the work of finding guests for a good reason, tell me that reason. And so what I wanted to do in the intro of Creative Elements was make that really, really clear. And that comes from laying out a good bio, talking very specifically even about why I'm bringing the person on the show, why I do care. And then I like to pull little snippets from the interview into the intro itself. You talked about this, because you can hear the guest's voice early, and it's a more effective storytelling technique to move the context and the story along through the voice of the guest than to just say this. This most recent episode I released today, I have a guest, and his YouTube bio was hilarious. He was like, I'm an art director, an animator, a director, a musician, and an all-around great guy. And those are like a bunch of different skills. So in the interview, I asked him, which one of these things did you learn first? And he just made a joke like, oh, well, definitely a great guy first. I thought that was endearing, and it tells the context of this guy does a bunch of stuff. So I took that out of the interview, and I said, this is good for the intro. And when I'm editing it, I pulled in the intro immediately. But that's a fun moment to also play as audio, as opposed to just saying, here's the bio straight out of the box.
I am now incredibly glad I did not ask you to introduce yourself. This is something I had been doing, and it wasn't until I listened to yours. By the way, I had so many great ideas for your podcast, so I'm sorry if these start sounding like yours over time. But it is very, very good. But yeah, I was listening to yours, and I was like, I noticed that you weren't doing that, and I kind of started thinking about it, and I was like, oh, I think there's a reason he doesn't do that. So yes, great tip.
Another very small thing that I think can make your production sound really good and takes no effort is to, once you transition from the intro into the interview, you may or may not have transition music. I like to have transition music because it moves the experience along. It's a cue to the listener that there's a state change of sorts, right? When I go into the interview, we don't need to hear my first question in the interview. I like to start the interview going right into the guest's response about something, because it becomes a story. It's like you're dropping right into the conversation, because the last thing you heard moving out of the intro was me talking anyway. So if I say, all right, let's get into this interview with Nick, and that transitions, and I say, Nick, tell me what you're doing before you started your YouTube channel. He's going to answer, well, before I started my YouTube channel, I was doing this. Imagine a world where you just cut out that question, and immediately it's, before I started my YouTube channel, I was just doing this. You didn't need my question. It's going right into the story. It's more engaging and immersive that way. So I would recommend you do that, because it's easy. You just cut out your first question.
That actually makes a lot of sense. Taken on board. Thank you. So while we're still on the editing process, what does that look like for you in terms of, so you've obviously sat down and you still have, this 45 minutes to an hour with this person, and then you go away and you go and edit it. Now, for someone like me who is incredibly lazy and started live streaming these, I would almost just take that file, very bad, I know, but take that file, cut off the first minute, cut off the last minute, and upload it. I'm now moving away from that, so this is probably my first selfish question, but what does that editing process look like? Because I know you obviously spend a fair amount of time in it, and that's where a lot of work is done in producing, what becomes this amazing episode. So what kind of overview, what does that look like for you?
So after I record the interview, we have separate audio files for myself and the guest. I send that to my audio engineer, who ties them together into a single file that sounds really great, removes the ums, the ahs, the filler words, anything else that just needs to be cut out. So I have a well-mixed interview as a standalone file. That's where editing to me starts. I drop that into GarageBand. I also generate a rough version of the transcript of that using a tool called otter.ai. It's a free transcripting tool. And I am essentially building the script of the entire episode on the fly as I'm editing. So I start listening through in real time. And when I hear little snippets that are usually in the first 5 to 10 minutes that feel like they're going to be good for the intro, I pull that earlier on in GarageBand. When I bring that interview in, by the way, I drop it at minute 5 in the GarageBand track. So I have essentially 5 minutes of dead space at the beginning that I know is going to be filled with voiceover and clips. When I hear something in the intro that feels like something, or when I hear something in the interview that feels like it'd be good for the intro, I pull it into the intro. Then I'm just listening through. I'm cutting out things that are unnecessary. I am cutting out like literally parts of dialogue that I feel like don't add value. I'll cut out parts of my questions that don't add value. I'll add space sometimes between the end of the guest's response and my next question, so it breathes really nicely. Sometimes I actually move questions around entirely. If we start on topic A, move to topic B, and then I ask another question about topic A, I might take that entire exchange and move it earlier in the interview so that everything is aligned. And yeah, I pretty much just do it all in real time. I'm constructing the script around 15 minutes in. I know I'm going to have an ad break, so I find a good stopping point that is a little bit of a cliffhanger, but also feels conclusive in a way. And I'll insert an ad break there with some voiceover. I'll do that again around minute 30. And anywhere through that episode that I feel an opportunity to pull in external audio, I do that too. So I'll go back to this example with Nick Denboer, who is also known as Smearballs online. He is a YouTuber, and he has just like super weird, wonky, hilarious, awesome videos on YouTube. I love interviewing YouTubers or podcasters because it gives me the ability to pull some of their work into the episode. He has a reel, like his portfolio essentially as an animator on YouTube, and he did the music for it. And it's like so bizarre, but I wanted people to feel that and understand who he was through the music. And so I asked him, like, after the interview, hey, can I use some of your material in the episode? He said, yeah, whatever you want. So I'll pull that episode or that audio in there so that when he says, yeah, so in 2011, I did this video called Sex Tape, which is a remix of an episode of The View. I pull that audio in. So I pause the interview there and go into that so people can hear it. It's as if you're watching something on TV. When somebody makes a reference, like, it's going to be so much better if you support that reference with the actual thing. And I just want to do in the podcast too. And so I'm literally just doing that on the fly in real time as I go through it. Where I have questions that I didn't ask well, I'll cut them out, make a note and say, replace this with voiceover. Once that's all arranged, I'll go back through to places where I marked put voiceover here. I'll script that. I'll script the closing, and I'll script the intro last. And then I record the voiceover. Then I send those usually 3 tracks. I'll have an interview track, a voiceover track, and a third-party audio track. I'll export them individually, send that back to my audio engineer, and he'll do a final mix on the whole thing.
I mean, it sounds aspirational to me and sounds like something that would take me absolutely forever, but obviously this is something you've refined over time, I'm sure. How long does that now take you on a weekly basis?
About 5 hours. 5 hours in real time, which I pretty much do in one go on a Saturday or Sunday most of the time. I kind of separate the tasks into 2 halves. Like, I do the listening through, arranging the episode, and marking where voiceover goes in one kind of sitting. And then if I have the energy, I'll then script and record afterwards. But like, the edit and arranging feels like a different type of mode for me. And once I get to the bottom of that, I'm often kind of like spent. And then I'll want a little bit of time to script and then record, which is usually just like the next day. But the other thing about doing it this way, there is kind of like this initial step where, as I'm listening through in real time, I cut every question and answer segment. I just make a cut in GarageBand, and I name that area what that question was so that I can see visually where we talked about what thing. And that, like, listening through and cutting and naming could be its own step before arranging. But I try to combine those steps into one now just to save a little bit of time and make this like a one deep work session once a week, whether I have to do it on the weekend or whether I allot some time during the week to do it. If I do it front to back, it's 4 or 5 hours.
That doesn't seem absolutely crazy for something that ends up like that. Kind of.
But it comes from practice. Like when I did it with Seth the first time, I went back and forth and did like 4 revisions over the course of like probably 2 months. And that was one of the shorter episodes we have. You know, now it's typically 45 to 60 minutes, and I just hear it as I'm going through. Like I listen through and I know this is what I'm going to open the episode with. This will sound great in the intro. Even though I don't script out the intro, I know this clip belongs in the intro. I just hear it and I put it up there. That just comes from practice. But now, like being able to just listen straight through, it feels a little bit more mechanical, which makes it less daunting. Like I know I just need to get into it. I just do it in real time, and I'll do it in a single pass, and it'll be great. But you know, I'm on episode 50 as of today of that show, and the other show has like 175. So I've just done a bunch of them.
Experienced podcaster. Also, congrats on 50 episodes. That's pretty damn cool.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, it's exciting.
Amazing. Yes, that is awesome stuff. So going back to, well, not going back to, starting with, you've now got this podcast ready to go, and you then need, so the podcasting world is very different to, say, the YouTubing world in terms of you can't just throw a file up and expect, you know, something to happen necessarily. So how do you go about promoting that episode, or maybe from the beginning, did you, obviously before you had this following, how do you start to grow a podcast effectively?
Super hard. Really, really hard. Because there is no, I won't say no, there's almost no organic discovery in podcasting the way that YouTube has, because YouTube is a search engine. People aren't searching for things in the podcasting world yet, really, unless they're looking for like, I know I just want to hear more about this guest. And so I play that game a little bit with some of these big names, but very little. What you need to know in terms of growing a podcast, if you can bring an existing audience to it, awesome. Do that all day. That's where you're going to have your best luck. Otherwise, the only thing that converts to podcast listeners is other podcast listeners. And that can come from cross-promoting with other podcasters, advertising on their show, doing like an interview swap where you have them on your show, you go on their show. Or, this is the holy grail, if you can get your show featured in different podcast listening apps on their Discover pages. Because as bad as podcast discovery is, the one place where it exists is in the discovery areas of podcast listening apps. So if you can get your show there as a notable show or in a certain category or something they recommend, that is where you really find some growth, because people are going there saying, I want to find a new podcast, and you're right there.
How does one go about getting themselves in those pages if they were trying to?
Each of these apps has like their own editorial team, and typically on their websites, they'll have a special area where you can request to be featured, or a way of contacting them to try and get featured. I have the good fortune of being on the Podglomerate Podcast Network, which already represents a bunch of shows. And Jeff has built relationships with these players over time. So he's just like pretty routinely keeping in touch with these different editorial teams, and he'll pitch whatever show on the network that makes sense to pitch to try and get some of these placements at the time. And working with Podglomerate from launch, they were able to help me secure some of those around launch. Ongoing, we have to kind of shoot our shot and see if we get lucky. Sometimes, like when COVID hit, the show got featured in the Life at Home category on Apple Podcasts, because we're all at home and people are becoming more interested in the creator economy, and this was kind of highlighting that. So it came down to a little bit of luck for me, but usually these players have like, here's a way that you can reach out to us and ask to be featured. Some of the smaller players even let you purchase space in that way, and that's probably the best paid marketing spend you can do in the podcasting world.
So obviously you have adverts in yours, you have people paying you for time on your podcast. So you've obviously monetized it over time, or actually possibly from the beginning. How does somebody starting out go and do that? Because again, with YouTube, it's almost an inbuilt thing. You hit, you know, these certain criteria and you get monetization, and then brands come to you. Whereas again, the podcasting world is a bit different, and I'm sure when you get to 500,000 downloads or something, people might start reaching out. But what's the best way to approach that as someone who is trying to grow a podcast in the first place?
Well, if you're going to go the advertising and sponsorship route, you need to understand that you're playing a game where people need to see a return on that investment. In any world, they need to see a return on the investment. Otherwise, they're not going to renew. If you don't think that you can create a situation where your sponsors will enthusiastically want to renew, you're probably too early to do sponsorship because you're just going to burn through a bunch of relationships essentially. So the best way that I would think about this is, if I have a smaller show, we did this on Upside. Upside's a much smaller show than Creative Elements, but historically it's made as much money as Creative Elements, but we play a different game. Creative Elements plays a CPM model where we are selling impressions across the entire catalog, and we dynamically insert ads based on the number of impressions that we sell. Upside, we bake that ad into the actual audio file, and it lives there forever. So we're not selling impressions, strictly speaking. We're selling placement in an episode, and we have a very different listener demographic on that show than I do with Creative Elements. On Upside, our listeners are typically pretty high net worth, highly intelligent, usually males, either startup founders or investors. And that type of person is very valuable to a certain type of business. We've had law firms sponsor in the past. We've had executive search firms sponsor in the past. And our pitch to those firms was, not only are you getting in front of our listeners, a single conversion of which will pay for your sponsorship, but we will even, in our conversations with guests on the show, because our guests are also founders or investors, if we hear them talk about a need for your services, we'll recommend you and we'll send a warm intro. So we're able to charge much more for those sponsorships on the Upside side of things because the conversion point, like the actual value of a converted customer, was way higher than what it is for a listener on Creative Elements who we have a sponsor I'm really excited about called Good Life Clothing. It's a clothing brand. It's an e-commerce brand. Their cart sizes is just a lot smaller. You could spend $50 at Good Life. You're not going to spend $50 on a law firm, So they need more conversions to show a return on investment sponsoring Creative Elements. And the only way to make that realistic is if you have a pretty large audience as it stands. So if you have a small show, think about who would find my listener valuable, so that the fewest listeners possible converting show a return on this investment. If you can't make that math problem work, then you're probably too early.
Okay, so podcasts traditionally, or even now, are audio only, and the idea is that they are consumed on something like a phone, but there has been a recent rise in the video podcasting space. Now, you are still audio only, and I believe you have considered the whole YouTube side of things in the past. What are your views on that, and do you have any plans for changing that up anytime soon?
I am envious of well-produced video-first podcasts because that is the ultimate level of making a single form and being able to multi-purpose it into everything else. However, the way that I do my show, I do all remote interviews. And so if I were to add on the video file that would be happening as I'm doing these interviews, because I put so much time into the edit and cutting these episodes, not only do I think it would be like a fairly boring viewing experience just to watch me talk to somebody, it would be jarring because of all the cuts you would see throughout it. When you listen to it, it sounds really smooth and like it was all really natural, but there's a lot of editing work that goes into it, which would be super clear if there was a visual component. So if I was able to dedicate the type of resources to do a show like Lewis Howes does or Matt Diavella did back in the day, that type of thing would be awesome. Joe Rogan does this really well. Pat McAfee does this really well. That would be awesome, but I'm not set up for it. And could I just like upload the audio on a static image and upload that on YouTube? Yes. Is that going to actually get any listeners? I doubt it. So I'm going to focus on just making audio only, making that really, really good so that there's not this incongruency of, well, the audio is so good. Why is the video not good? Because subconsciously we start to think like, maybe this isn't as good or as legit as I thought it was. I can make the audio sound so legit. So I don't want to give anyone any reason to think that it's less legit than it is. And I worry that poor video would have that effect.
Again, from your point of view, that makes so much sense because you already have like this top quality product. So actually, even if you did spend a bit more time, what would the return even be? Is it even worth spending a little bit extra?
Yeah, I would rather just like do so good in audio that I'm getting a bigger audio audience, and maybe I'll move that to email or Twitter. But I just haven't made the leap into video yet because I don't think I'm equipped for it to make it look as good as I want it to look.
So, again, remote interviewing, that's kind of the world we're in right now, which is great because it's opened up so many doors, like this conversation right now. But post whatever's happening in the world and the whole situation that we find ourselves in, do you find yourself... do you plan to carry on doing what you've been doing? Have you thought beyond that? Or, like you said, the whole having in-person interviews obviously would be super cool. But you've obviously created this thing. Yes, it was created in lockdown, but you've created something that works so well. Have you thought about how that would shift?
I could do in-person interviews and have the same final product. I have two in-person interviews on the Creative Elements feed right now. James Clear was actually in person, and so was episode 3 with Danielle Evans. So final product wise, you can't tell the difference. And I could do them in person. It's fun. It adds a certain different element. It also adds a lot of a commute for both me and the guest. It makes the ask higher. So I'm going to go with whatever is going to give me the best chance to get great guests. And remote is probably going to continue to be the way to go. However, if we get back into a world where I'm going to CES or South by Southwest every year again, that's a really good opportunity for some serendipity and meeting people in person because they happen to be there and they want to justify their time and trip there. They want to have good, memorable, productive meetings while they're there, so they feel like, oh, it was a good decision to do that. And in-person interviews is a way to take advantage of that. So maybe in a world where I'm going to conferences again, but unlikely otherwise.
So you have, like I've said, you have a host of amazing guests that have been on, and I'm not going to ask you to pick a favorite because that would be totally unfair, but is there anybody that hasn't been on that you would absolutely love to have on the show one day?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so many. I mentioned Pat McAfee. He's a YouTuber. Would love to have Pat McAfee on the show. Would love to have Bo Burnham on the show. Would love to have Rishikesh Sherway, who creates Song Exploder, on the show. Actually, one of the first people that I ever reached out to be on the show that I was really excited to get on, and he ignored every email. I just scheduled time with him today. So that's very exciting. His name is Cole Kushna. He hosts a podcast called Dissect, where every season is about an album, musical album, and every episode is like a super high quality 45-minute dissection of this like 3-minute song. So good. Season 2, he dissected Kanye's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. It's like the best, I'll call it the best art project I've ever seen. And then this new season 8, he's doing Kanye again, and it's Yeezus. And I am so pumped to have him on to talk about this. The show was acquired by Spotify, one of the first Spotify original shows. So I'm pumped about it. I would name him as saying, like, this is someone I want to have on the show, but I'm doing it. It's happening.
That is absolutely amazing. Congratulations.
Ooh, one more. Yoga with Adrienne. I want to get Adrienne on the show. I have an email out to her. She has not responded. I will follow up on it one day. But here's the thing. I shoot out a lot of cold emails to people that are difficult to reach. And I know they're probably not going to respond. What I'm not going to do is follow up like 3 days later and say, hey, hope you saw this. I'll follow up like 3 months later. If I don't hear from her, I'll follow up in like 3 months and say, would still love to have you on the show. No rush. I'm going to be recording this into perpetuity. Let me know if you'd be interested. And then I'll do that again 6 months later. Like, it's a slow burn. The best thing is when somebody gives me a very kind, respectful pass. I won't name drop this person, but I had an email exchange with somebody that I also want to really interview. He said he has a pass right now. And I said, no problem. I hope you don't mind if I follow up in 6 months to see if things have changed. And he said, please do. Your show is great. And I thought that was almost as good as a yes. Because when somebody says like, yes, but not now, that's basically a yes, just a future yes. So you put that on your list to follow up with and you come back later. But it's a yes. It's just not a right now yes.
I do like it when people respond to you because you're like, it's like closing the loop, whether it's a yes or a polite decline. Like it's just a nice thing. And that's no disrespect to the other people because obviously I'm sure they get millions of emails and one from me is probably the last thing on their list, but it's still very nice to get something that just isn't going to work or not now is always nice to hear. Do you have any tips about reaching out to people? Again, if you don't have the background that you do and the sort of show pitch that you do for other people to almost do those cold emails?
Be direct, be short, be low pressure, and be understanding is the way I would frame it. The more credibility you can put into the email, and not so much that you make a really long email, but like when I interview people or when I email people, here's what it looks like. I put in the subject line, in brackets, interview request, and then I'll say, can we talk about your creative career? And then I'll say, hey, Bob, I've been following your work for 2 years. I saw you posted this thing. Absolutely loved it. And I wanted to reach out to you to see if you would come on this podcast I have. It's called Creative Elements. It's a high production narrative interview style show where I talk about how creators made a living from their art and creativity. And I would love to tell your story. And then I put like in bold, the pitch and like a very short Creative Elements has interviewed creators like Seth Godin, James Clear, Vanessa Van Edwards about how they made a living from their art and creativity. It's on the Podglomerate Podcast Network. It's been featured in Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Apple Podcasts, and Castbox. And then in bold, would you be open for a 45-minute remote interview for the show? Zero pressure, zero expectation. Anytime the next few months is fine. If you're up for it, I'll send you my scheduling link. I know you're busy, so no pressure either way, and thanks for the consideration.
I will be tweaking mine. Actually, really quick question on that. You don't give them the scheduling link straight away. Is there a reason for that?
It feels presumptive.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I want to say, like, I want to have you on the show. And if you're up for that, let me know. I'll send the scheduling link. But me personally, I don't like when people send me a cold email with a scheduling link. It's like, who do you think you are? Fuck off. Whereas if they're like, hey, can I interview on the show? It's like, sure, send it along. It's a weird nuance and maybe one that I'm overthinking, but I very much want it to be an opt-in. Like, would love to have you on the show. You up for it? Usually they're like, let's do it. And I say, hell yes, right away. And I send them the link and say, here's where you can schedule. If none of these times look good for you, please let me know what looks best for your schedule, and I'll try to accommodate.
That's yeah, okay. I didn't originally, and then I started to, because I was like, when I was starting to reach, and I've clearly done this the wrong way around, but when I was starting to reach out to bigger people, I was like, maybe I should put it in because I don't have time to have this back and forth. I'll just throw it in and be like, hey, if this is interesting, and here's this if it makes it easier. But it's definitely one to think about. It's a good point.
It's possible. My gut says no. Like, I just reached out and pitched Ryan Holiday. And I know he very specifically has said things like, don't ask me if you can ask a question. Ask the question. And so for him specifically, I thought, like, should I just ask? But then I thought, I am asking the question. I'm asking if he'll be on my show. And if the answer is yes, I'll send you the link. And I even went so far as to say, I know you do your interviews like in batches. I know that when you do book launches, you do a lot of podcasts. What I would love is to just be on your publisher's list so that the next time you're doing this, I would love to be one of the shows you come on. I didn't even say, would you come on right now? I said, the next time you're doing the interview circuit, I would love to be one of them. That was the approach I took with him and what I'll take with like really high, big name guests. But what I'm finding is, even for me, and I have a show that has, 20,000 unique listeners every month, I still can't get everybody that I want. I still reach really high. and I get ignored sometimes. But I don't think it's lack of interest. I think that I need to start shortcutting the process again a little bit. I had Jordan Harbinger on the show, one of the biggest podcasters on the planet, but that was a direct intro from Vanessa Van Edwards. And I know if I just went to Vanessa or now Jordan and said, could you introduce me to A, B, or C? They'd say, yeah, let me see if I can. But I haven't pushed myself to do that as much as I should.
This has been awesome. This has been so incredibly valuable. So I just want to thank you for A, your time, and B, your podcasting wisdom.
Thank you, Bob. I enjoyed being here. A lot of what I covered is in my podcasting course in even more detail. So if you are starting a podcast and you really want to go deeper on this stuff, would be happy to help you through podcasts like the pros. But otherwise, this is a really good primer. I hope you do start a podcast, you listening to this right now, and do it for the long haul. Believe this is a long game, and the sooner you get started, the better.
Amazing. Yes, the podcast course looks absolutely insane. And if this is a primer, then I think we all know how good that course is going to be. So amazing. Please check it out, guys. I will put everything in the description below where you can find Jay. And by the way, his incredible website. I'm blown away. It's one of the best websites I've ever seen. It's just amazing, which again is no surprise given everything else is top quality. But everything will be linked up below. Huge thanks to you, Jay, and I will see everybody next week. Bye, guys.